Great. Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Lisa from Question the Narrative, and it is Friday, the 17th of March. I think that's St. Patrick's Day. So happy St. Patrick's Day to everybody who's Irish and everybody who wants to be Irish.
Not wearing
That's
green
pretty
today.
much everybody out there. So welcome to today's show. And we're doing something a little bit different. But as we say here in Question the Narrative, we question everything we read, we see, and what we hear. And one of the things we want to do is to learn a little bit more about what's happening in our world, and the military is a big part of our world. And today I'm really honored to be able to welcome Captain Chuck Ruffin, who is with the U.S. Space Force. Now, I was really excited when I saw the initial introduction of this new branch of the military, because I have to say I'm just a little bit excited about space travel, adventure out there, and aircraft. My father, my sister, all have been engineers who have been designing for military, and I was always very excited about that. And when I heard that Captain Chuck was out there speaking about this, I was really excited. So I reached out, and he graciously said, "Yes, I will speak with you." So I wanted to welcome you here, Captain, and say welcome. And how are you today?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. Definitely appreciate every invite and every opportunity to talk about the Space Force. It's brand new and very unique, and a lot of people are very interested in it, which is excellent. I've learned a lot about what people want to know about the Space Force and what we do. So it's really exciting to be here. So appreciate you having me on.
Terrific. And maybe you can guide me a little bit if I don't get all the questions in.
Yeah.
So first of all, you just mentioned the first thing. Most people have not heard of Space Force. Could you give us a little bit of background about what Space Force is and how it started?
Yeah, absolutely. So the history of the Space Force kind of finds its roots in multiple branches of the military. Back in the early 50s, actually, the Army and the Navy were taking the first steps towards modern rocketry, and they were kind of the, I guess, if you will, like the starters of what the space race really came to be was through the Army and the Navy programs that they had back then. Over time, the Air Force started developing a pretty robust program, and for the past few decades, the Air Force has essentially managed the majority of the space program through headquarters Air Force Space Command. And now, since the NDAA was signed, we established the first ever branch of military solely dedicated to space operations. A lot of people didn't realize that the space program was kind of buried into multiple branches of the military. The Navy and the Army, as well as the Air Force, all had their ties to space in some way, whether it came from satellite communications or to missile warning and missile defense, which we used since the Cold War era.
Well, you mentioned something NDAA signed. What is the NDAA?
Yeah, the National Defense Authorization Act. It's essentially the president's way of establishing a bill that helps fund the federal government. And within that document outlines specific categories that they're willing to fund or establish from the National Defense Authorization Act. And so from the 2019 one, within it was the establishment of the United States Space Force, as well as the establishment of the United States Space Command, which is the combatant command for the Space Force.
Okay, so we have Space Force, Space Command. Sounds like a lot of space out
Yeah.
there, which obviously there is, and we'll go into that. So
Yes.
brand new part of the government. So you were saying that it was originally under multiple different parts of the military. We'll get into that a little bit more about control and organization of the Space Force. But let's first talk a little bit about you. And how would someone end up in this new branch of the military? So tell us, what did you have prior military service, and how did you end up in Space Force?
Yeah, sure. I'm kind of a unique person. I've been in over 17 years now. So I started my service in 2005. I was primarily in the Air Force. And then I earned my commission in 2016. And when I earned my commission, I became a space operations officer in the Air Force. So within the Air Force, we had space operations career fields that were both enlisted and officer. And once the establishment of the Space Force occurred, all of the core AFSCs that were associated to space were automatically transferred over into the Space Force. And so the members filling those career fields, we had a opportunity to either reclass into another career field if we wanted to, or bring ourselves over to the United States Space Force as the first core component of the branch of military.
Well, that's
Yeah, it's pretty exciting.
so what was that background? You said, what is your specialty, and what kind of educational background did you have in order to go through this process to get to where you are today?
Great question. I have a plethora of degrees. I started my career as an intelligence analyst. So my first couple of bachelor's degrees that I have are both in intelligence. I earned a bachelor's of science through the National Intelligence University. And then I went on to procure my master's degree in cybersecurity from Webster University. And I got my commission through my degree from the Intelligence University, but it didn't really play a role into my space, I guess, operations career field. When I went to go apply to be an officer, you select which career fields you want to join or you're interested in, and then the Air Force determines which one you fall into as far as a category. So number 3 pick was the space operations career field. Even though I had a background from Air Force Space Command, I did 3 years there as an enlisted member. So that was kind of like my first part of space experience, at least introduced to space operations was at that time.
Okay, so 2 interesting things there. First of all, I would have never thought about intelligence analyst, but I guess that makes a lot of sense because everything about space is digital and information that comes from that. We'll get into that. And cyber. So I've heard you talk quite a bit about the cyber part of that.
Yes.
So does that mean you also have a technical background in IT, information engineering, or is this something not related to the cyber part of what you do?
Yeah, I mean, I have kind of a background in most areas. So for me, my education was just kind of develop me as a person. I was interested in computers at a very young age. When I was in high school, I was going through network administration classes. So I had always had an interest in computers. With intelligence, I wanted to shape my career by forming my education around that as well, which was really great for development for me as an airman at the time. And getting my master's in cybersecurity, ultimately that would give me kind of what we call the trifecta: understanding space operations, overall intelligence analysis, as well as introductory to cybersecurity. Understanding cybersecurity is a huge component of how we defend and protect our architecture, not just for space operations within the DoD, but as the entire world ultimately. You know, we have the internet pretty much touching every aspect of life now when it comes to mobile devices and computers. So I was hugely interested in understanding how cybersecurity plays a role.
Well, that's really interesting. So from what you're saying there, could I assume that Space Force in some respects is the protection for all the military communications to support their efforts?
To some degree, yeah, we do have cybersecurity professionals within the United States Space Force. Primarily, their roles are focused around defending the DoD infrastructure. So when it comes to telemetry or telecommunications, that architecture is protected and defended by our cybersecurity professionals. And then we also have, sites that require commanding, right, to the satellites on orbit. So we also have cyber professionals that help support those architectures as well, and watch them for any vulnerabilities.
That's terrific. We'll talk more about satellites later, but let's go into that. So it sounds like Space Force, I mean, lots of educational background to get in there. It's a place where you really have to have multiple strengths in order to be participating in this area.
Yeah, sure. It takes time. I mean, you don't have to have it all up front. The DoD is really good about providing you resources throughout your career to develop yourself as now a guardian. So, any new member that's interested, they don't have to have such an extensive background that I have going in. They go through the normal recruiting process by visiting Air Force recruiting, and then tell them that they're interested in the United States Space Force. And then they'll, of course, test to see if they're eligible to join. from
Right.
that
That's good.
perspective. Yeah.
You also said, and I love this word, that you're called a guardian. I
Yes.
just think that's such a beautiful term. Can you tell us a little bit about the genesis of that term and what it meant?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the Air Force Space Command culture and a lot of the mottos that we had seen across the Air Force for the past few decades usually incurred or incorporated the word guardian. The headquarters Air Force Space Command motto was Guardians of the High Frontier. And so we've seen this throughout literature from Air Force publications about space operations, that we are always the guardians of the high frontier. And so we adopted that term as, that is our moniker for all of the members that are in the Space Force. We are all called guardians.
Yeah, I think that's a really wonderful way. I mean,
Yeah,
words matter, I think, and it's interesting we don't
sure.
do it. And I think this is such a wonderful way. It's protection and service and, there to support. I just think it's a beautiful term. So I love
Yeah,
it.
it's a
Thanks.
really great word. It's developed a really good culture among fellow guardians. And, there's always a jokes like, each service likes to give each other jabs, every once in a while. So, but it's still a really excellent term.
Which is what we all should do about that. Well, actually, that
Yeah,
leads right into the next area I wanted to really probe on, which is organizational structure of Space Force,
sure.
and sort of chain of command. Is it a normal chain of command where there, within the Space Force, you have your director, and does then the Space Force report directly into the commander in chief, or is there a different structure that has gone on for Space Force?
That's a great question too. So we do have a chief of space operations. We actually just transferred into our second one. Our first one was General John Raymond, and
Mhm.
now we have General B. Chance Saltzman, who is the second chief of space operations. So that is the highest ranking military officer that we have for the Space Force. And so he has same access to the rest of the higher ranking military leaders that are
Mhm.
direct report to the commander in chief. And so our organization after him is a little more flat, as like we like to call it. We have eliminated a couple of organization structures between we have as a field command, and then underneath the field command, we have what's called deltas. A delta is symbolized by the similar Space Force symbol that we have, but each delta is representative of a specific mission set. The one that I support here is the Delta 13, and our organization is primarily focused on professional military education and development of guardians. And we have several programs that we support from the enlisted and the officer side. And then below our deltas, we have squadrons. And then those squadrons vary in mission type. They either support an operation, depending on which field command they're aligned to, or there are support staff for the Delta.
Okay. So you mentioned that there are a variety of deltas. You're 13. How many deltas are there?
That's a good question. I don't know how many we have now off the top of my head.
Okay.
I know we
Not to put you
have,
on there.
yeah, that's okay.
Okay, no, but it sounds like
Every
there's
day the
some
number
interesting things.
changes.
Okay, no, it's interesting what you're doing on that
Yeah.
area. I love that you're flat. So when you said you are transitioning into your second general, 1 star, 2 star, 3 star, 4 star, does it matter which star general or
Yeah, he would be a 4-star general.
4 star general? Okay,
Mhm.
great. So then goes right into commander in chief. Wonderful. So you know how most military schools, military organizations have a feeder school. Is there anything like that for Space Force now?
Are you saying like a
Like
school for
West
them?
Point for the
Oh,
Army,
sure.
the JAG Corps.
Yeah, so we do our accessions through United States Air Force Academy still.
Mhm.
And we have a detachment that operates within the Air Force Academy. It is Detachment 1 that's also assigned to Delta 13 as a subordinate organization. So they
Mhm.
do all of the Guardian accessions through the Air Force Academy.
Uh,
And so each Guardian does have their own flight where they go through education and training
hmm,
through USAFA kind of separately, but also incorporated with the rest of the Air Force cadets as well.
Terrific. Okay, cool. Makes a lot of sense. So Air
Yeah.
Force, Space Force are very, very coordinated.
Yeah,
So,
the core, I think, what is similar in alignment is, I forgot to mention this earlier, was we fall underneath the Department of the Air Force. So similar to how the Department of the Navy has the branch of the Navy and the Marine Corps, the Department of the Air Force has the Air Force and the Space Force.
that makes sense then. Okay,
Yeah.
got it.
So a
Okay.
lot of the Air Force programs that are still out there, that are well established, right? Since it's over 75 years now old, and we're just a few years old in comparison. We still
Mhm.
leverage a lot of the Air Force training and education resources,
Yeah,
but we are starting to establish some of our own independent programs.
terrific. Got it. So the US established this version of the Space Force in 2019, as you said. Do other countries have a Space Force? And if so, which countries do?
Sure. There's several countries that have interest in space operations. Can't tell you off the top of my head which ones exactly have a space force similar to ours, but I know the UK and Canada, as well as Japan, all have their own version of their space military forces,
Mhm.
and each of them are thankfully allies for for us. They support us in joint operations, combined operations as well. Some of them even work in our sites and facilities for combined space operations, which is really excellent that we get to have foreign partners that help us with space operations around the world.
That's good. So but it's not ubiquitous around the world that there is a Space Force.
Right. Yeah. The primarily you'll find spacefaring nations that have access to space. Will have some type of space branch of military or space forces that do space operations. Sometimes they're blended with other career fields as well, or
Right.
other specialties. But the United States is the one that we have a dedicated space force as a branch of military.
Yeah. So when you look at it then, so if not many of the countries have a Space Force program, is the US a leader and responsible for supporting and protecting, guarding Earth or Terra, what she may be called
Yeah.
right now?
Yeah, so we do have a mission set called Space Domain Awareness, and a lot of the data that we utilize goes into kind of an international database that's accessible to anyone in the world. We track over 20,000 different objects in space, and it goes into a catalog. It's a satellite catalog that is managed and maintained by a lot of guardians, even civilians. And civilians can go out and see what is out there in space from websites called Celestrak. Celestrak has the larger catalog of it. And there's over 4 to about 5,000 different active satellites from individual nations all around the world that are on orbit to date that we also track. There's a significant amount of debris as well that we keep a close eye on, and in order to kind of ensure safety of space, we do have relationships with other countries to inform them whether or not they're going to be impacted by potential space debris.
Mhm.
It kind of builds that relationship of excuse me, utilizing space freely and safely.
Yeah, so you said a couple things there that to me, I'll phrase it in my terms, see if I'm getting it right. So the awareness of it and the information that you're tracking is open source. You do it in a way that everybody can have access to it.
Yeah,
Correct.
absolutely. There are the majority of the items that are tracked out in space is open source. It's accessible to anybody, and you can ultimately see that that data is compiled of different space systems that are on orbit. It gets pretty extensive. It does list out like what type of satellite it is. For instance, if it's a satellite communications or if it's a weather satellite. So the data is accessible. Of course, there are programs in the DoD that are going to be a little bit more secure for valid reasons when it comes to national security.
Yeah.
But the majority of the information out there is pretty accessible, and there's several different civilian based organizations that also do space exploration or space research that we have come to find good relationships with them, especially when they identify objects that we may not have.
Okay. Interesting. So people are allowed to, it's open source, you watch debris, you communicate with other nations, you communicate with other organizations. And you also said civilians have access to this. Do you coordinate anything with the civilian, with any civilian organizations that you can say about?
So there's several different civilian organizations that we interact with. I can't think of anything on the space domain awareness side, but they do partner with us to help with monitoring of space. And when it comes to identifying or tracking events, we're able to pull in their data as well and combine it with ours. It helps with us making sure that those items that are orbiting Earth are either tracking the way they're supposed to, or if there's any kind of anomalies, we can leverage their information to, compare and contrast and determine if there's
Yeah.
any threats to other objects.
Makes sense. That makes sense. So you got
Yeah.
coordination, which is very good communication. So you are part of the military. Do you deal with military alliances around the world, such as NATO or any other alliances?
I personally don't, but we do have other relationships with some of our foreign partners. We maintain the same relationships as the other branches of the military. We do a lot of really great combined operations with other nations of service when it comes to space operations. Some great news articles out there that have come out for the past few years, especially building our relationships with the UK and Canada, and more recently Japan and some other nations out there. So it's quite unique to see, what they want or what they need from space operations, and we can to develop those relationships. It's very important for us to maintain a positive relationship with those countries.
That's good. Interesting. Got it.
Yeah.
Got it.
Mhm.
So let's go into a little bit something more about things. Air Force has their aircraft. The Navy has all of their ships and different things.
Sure.
The Army has their tanks. Is there anything that is unique from a equipment point of view with Space Force?
Good question. When it comes to satellites, I guess I can narrow it down to one main one. Majority of Americans, I think, they utilize navigation capabilities, right? So we all use our cell phones to navigate to and from whichever destination we're going to, and that's enabled by GPS. When the Air Force was in charge of space operations, GPS was managed and maintained 24/7 by airmen. So it was not ran or managed or maintained by civilians. The DoD is the one that makes sure that the GPS constellation is on orbit and still providing navigation capabilities. So now that satellite constellation has moved over to the Space Force. So all of your Guardians are now running that system of constellation for satellites for GPS. And so that's one major component when it comes to critical infrastructure. GPS enables everyday way of life. And your Guardians are the ones managing, maintaining the state of health, as well as ensuring the satellites are still performing the way they need to.
Yeah. Well, thank goodness, because I would not get anywhere without the
Yeah.
GPS. It's
Yeah.
fundamentally changed my life. So that's a big part of it. But those satellites themselves, they're not Space Force equipment. That's equipment that you utilize the information from in order to do that. So are there ships that are different, or aircraft that are different from what Air Force has that Space Force may be looking at?
So not in the sense of like aircraft or anything. We haven't dove into the world of putting a spacecraft on orbit where it can be manned or anything.
Okay.
We do support all of the space launches. So the Space Force bases that we have in Vandenberg Space Force Base, as well as down in Florida, all of the space launches that occur, those sites are managed also by Guardians. We do have our own payload systems that we put into space that we manage and maintain. We also support launches for our ISR community as well when they put other satellites in orbit for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance purposes. So it's a gambit of support across the board of what we can do for capabilities. And as far as crafts, we don't have a spaceship or anything yet, unfortunately.
Actually, but one of the things I was thinking of is that there's a new company that's called Boom that does supposedly supersonic air travel. And I was curious if Space Force is involved in exploring and researching more innovative space or travel technology as it relates to space and air. Is there anything
Yeah,
associated with
I
Boom or those
think
types of technologies?
I've heard of Boom before, but I'm not too familiar with what their company entails. Most of our AOR, if you will, our area of responsibility, it starts at the international recognized line, which is the Kármán line. It's about 62 miles or 100 kilometers. So anything from 100 kilometers out into space is
Mhm.
kind of where we begin our area of responsibility when it comes to space operations. So below that, though, we do have close relationships with civilian science and research and development organizations. I'm not sure exactly which ones off the top of my head. I know that NASA does a lot of the partnerships for us when it comes to federal R&D organization. They are the backbone for that portion of it. And then, of course, Space Force usually develops partnerships with civilian organizations or companies that might have an interest within the DoD.
Okay.
We're still growing as well, so we have a lot of new things happening that
Okay.
it's hard for me even to keep up with.
No, I mean, it's
Um,
very difficult when you're part of a large organization to
yeah,
do everything. So to do that, but that just curious what we're doing on that. I'm personally very interested in very fast, high-speed technologies for
yeah,
travel, which I think was something that was done when you had the Concorde, and then that went away, and that boom is coming back. Semi-similar type of thing. But you mentioned something, you said that Space Force is responsible for 100 kilometers and above out into space. And then
mhm.
you mentioned this thing called the Kármán line. What is the Kármán line?
The Kármán line is kind of the international recognized boundary between space and the atmosphere.
Okay.
So it was discovered by a scientist, and ultimately that is the lowest point in space that you could put something into orbit before the atmospheric drag starts to take a role on that object. So anything below 62 miles, while the internationally, I guess there's a recognized boundary about 50 miles, where NASA determines that to be the point where you become an astronaut. But from 50 miles to 62 miles, there's still some atmospheric drag there. So when it comes to putting an object into space that requires an orbit, you have to break that Kármán line in order to keep it onto orbit and maintain it.
Okay, good. These
Yeah.
are terms that the average person doesn't really use very often. So it's
Yeah.
really. Then you also talked about NASA, which is another thing I wanted to understand. What is the relationship with Space Force and NASA, and what is the distinction about what NASA is responsible for and what Space Force would be
Yeah,
responsible
I get that question quite a bit.
for? I'd imagine you
And
would.
I actually learn something new every day when it comes to answering that question, because I don't interact with NASA directly, but what we've learned over time is that NASA, you can think of that organization has been around for decades, and they primarily focus on research and development, science, and all of the civilian based research and development that you do when it comes to leveraging space to help enable those projects. And and you think of them as kind of the federal government's way of pursuing different initiatives, different research, different science in order to make new discoveries. That's kind of how NASA is developed. There's a lot more that goes into it. They support space programs as well. They have Mars rover program. They have their own launches as well that go to the moon. Hopefully, in the next few years, we'll see the Artemis project go, and we'll see the Artemis reach the moon and put man back on the moon. And then several other research and development projects. They put out a lot of really great reads out there. I actually have one of their space publications that they put out normally. It's called NASA Spinoff, and that's actually a federally mandated document that they put out every year. The spinoff is kind of their, it's a congressional report that they put out to showcase all of the different experiments, science, research that they've done through NASA, and to show how it actually has benefited society. And so there's a lot of really interesting projects out there that NASA has done that helped facilitate some of the way we live today. For instance, like baby formula. The reason why we have the baby formula that we do now is because they designed and developed a method to bring food out to the International Space Station, so that way astronauts and our partners would have a way to get essential vitamins and minerals while they're in space. So baby formula was kind of
Okay.
a result of that. That's just one fun thing I like to do because I used it a lot when I raised my kids. So it's great to know that space had something to do with how they were able to get fed. So
Most innovation comes from military research, whether it's
yeah,
space, Earth, or whatever. Got it on there. So
yeah,
NASA's
and
been
then
it. So
yeah, and
NASA.
then
Oh, I'm so sorry.
yeah, I was gonna say, and then the side of it that the Space Force does, since we're aligned underneath Department of Defense, everything is defense related. So ultimately, when it comes to national security, right, we protect and defend critical infrastructure. We protect and defend our assets that are in space that help provide services to the warfighter. So any branch of military that relies on specific capabilities that are enabled by space, the Space Force does the protection and defense of those systems, to include terrestrial-based systems like telemetry and commanding that we use for ground communications to our satellites, a whole gambit of things.
Well, that's really interesting because what you're talking about here is that Space Force is about protecting, being the guardians of the critical infrastructure. And I think one of the more critical pieces of infrastructure as we continue to progress technologically as a society are the satellites that you've mentioned a few times. So let's go into the satellite discussion
Yeah,
because
yeah, for
satellites
sure.
are the foundation of communication, the foundation of me being able to get around with a GPS system.
Yeah.
I seriously mean that. And the foundation of all of our communications, which then allows us to make sure that we're not going to have misunderstandings and live harmoniously on this planet that we share. So the main satellites that are out there are communication satellites that I've heard of, and then there's this new thing called Starlink. How
Yeah.
important is Starlink, and what does Starlink do? And is it different from the other satellites that have been put out into our space for communications?
Yeah, so when it comes to satellite communications, we have various types. We have military satellite communications, which are solely dedicated to warfighters that are utilizing SATCOM link, that is DoD. And then you have civilian satellite communications, which any spacefaring nation that has their own satellite on orbit can utilize satellite communications and have that capability to them. What we're starting to see now is, as you mentioned, Starlink being a much larger constellation of satellites, kind of like a mesh network in space, where you utilize multiple satellites to give you a lot of ground coverage, as you have a continuous orbit over certain areas that may had denied access at one point. So Starlink is definitely a commercial based SpaceX, Elon Musk, initiative. And it's very crucial in some areas of the world where they may not have had access to satellite communications or Wi-Fi enabled capabilities in their countries. What we've seen a lot now in the news is Starlink was helping the Ukraine conflict. Ukrainians were getting a lot of their communication capabilities destroyed or taken out by the Russians, and Starlink came in and helped them reestablish a communications network. And that's really crucial when it comes to rapid employment of communication. It helps manage and maintain your forces, especially when you have a large land war, and being able to kind of maintain a good sight picture of how that conflict is going. So when it comes to larger mesh networks like that, there's a lot of really great benefits to it. But then when it comes to the Space Force side and space domain awareness, it brings its own challenges. Now you have, I think the recent number was about 3,000 of the soon-to-be Starlink satellites on orbit. I don't recall off the top of my head exactly, but think of those as new objects now that the Space Force is tracking and monitoring.
And
So that
guarding, right?
and guarding
Yeah.
exactly, and they're all in a low Earth orbit, so they're much closer to Earth, and a lot more vulnerable to other satellites or other debris that is also in low Earth orbit. So it's constant. It takes 24/7, round the clock. Really intelligent people out there to keep an eye on
Yeah.
these objects as they continue to orbit.
Well, that's interesting. So they're low orbit, which is interesting. There are multiple ones of it. So how do you protect it? It's just with normal aircraft that you protect it, or is it by other means or other satellites that protect
Yeah, that's a good question. So if we do get good indications and warning ahead of time of something that potentially could impact a satellite, everything that's in space has thrusters that can potentially move it in a direction out of harm's way. When it comes to orbital mechanics, the physics play differently out in space. So
it? Yeah.
you have a lot more considerations to think through, but generally directions are all the same. You got to go left, got to go right, got to go up or down. But it gets a little bit more complicated when it comes to the engineering of the system itself and what its capability is. So if we get indications and warning that there might be a threat to their payload or to their satellite, we do make notifications as needed and as timely as possible. And then, it's up to them to either acknowledge that notification and, protect their system and move, or, we've seen other collisions in the past where they didn't do that, and we've had two satellites collide and cause a very large debris cloud. So
So who
um,
takes care of it? Like for Starlink, do they have their own group that
mhm.
protects them and moves that around and has aircraft to do something? Or is it something that they hire out? Is that a third party activity for them?
Yeah, that's all internal to Starlink. They have their own satellite operations center where they have their own people within it that manage the satellites. Thankfully, when it comes to putting something on orbit, uh, once you put it up there, it does most of its work by itself. A lot of commanding and controlling can be done by automated computer software now. So when it starts to detect its own anomalies, just by natural occurrences, it can make small adjustments, here and there to maintain its orbit. But for something more larger or more serious, a space debris potentially impacting that satellite,
Yeah.
that would take a little bit more coordination and communication to execute those commands in a way that would still keep it into mission while also avoiding that threat.
Wow.
Yeah.
So a lot of commercial technology is connected in with Space Force and in space with satellites in particular. There are also, discussions in the New York Times article recently that talked about the Russian spring offensive and would have some cyber attacks, and that talks about how Microsoft is actually a contractor for Ukrainian military. Do you guys in Space Force get involved in ensuring that US technology is used appropriately with other countries' military, or is that something that you guys don't get involved in?
Yeah, I think that's more outside of the Space Force lane. That would probably be more of a Department of State or other organization that would handle those.
Absolutely.
Um,
Nicely
yeah,
said, nicely said, yeah.
yeah,
Those are complex
yeah,
discussions amongst nations,
they
yeah.
are. And not to say that we don't have good professionals or good stewards within the Space Force that would, either be involved in those conversations. I'm not sure at to what degree we would be involved with when it comes to those types of technologies. I know a lot of times we're told what we can do and who we can interact with. And so when it comes to international relationships, or at least those software capabilities being extended to international countries, there's a lot of different players that would get involved, more
Yeah.
so than just the Space Force.
Yeah, it's very complex.
Yeah.
I have to ask my sort of last sort of big question area, because
Yeah.
it's been so informative. I really appreciate it. There's so much to have learned here and more to talk about. But
Sure.
given that what we're hearing now in the mainstream media is talks of the government saying, well, we may have had discussions, we may have had a connection with UFOs or aliens
Yeah.
that may be out there. I would think that Space Force, our guardians in the sky, would have a little bit more insight into that concept than other areas within it. So
Sure.
I have to ask the question, do you know anything about UFOs, aliens, and what could you tell us?
I get this question all the time, usually like through my TikTok channel. If we had anything to do with the UFOs. Um, Unfortunately, I don't have any personal experience with UFOs or anything, but I have seen it, being talked about in media, which is even exciting for a guardian like myself, to see that, hey, there's potential for UFOs and interactions with that. To what level, I personally don't know. I know that it's a hot topic right now, and we've seen some really interesting footage being released from aircraft of unidentified flying objects and the
Yeah.
like. So it's interesting to see what is coming more available to the public. Would Space Force play a role?
Yeah.
Maybe in the realm of detecting any unidentified flying objects and trying to attribute what its origin is. Absolutely. The space domain awareness capabilities that we have with radar technology or even our overhead capabilities. Um, Most likely we would leverage some resources to try to determine what the origins are of those objects. And of course that would go into either an intelligence report or something that would go up to leadership to help them make informed decisions on how they should respond or react. But yeah, Space Force would play a role
Yeah.
in helping that process anyways.
So how would it work? So say there was something a little bit more sort of clear that was
Yeah.
out there and it was identified. How would Space Force, who would Space Force work with in order to come up with this right or the best solution or understanding of what this object may be?
Yeah. So most of the time what would typically occur is that if an object like that was detected, there would be a gambit of guardians and different organizations that would kind of connect with each other. One would be coming from intelligence, right? You'd have intelligence sources that would help provide a clearer picture if there is one. If there's any kind of communications coming from it, would we be able to detect those types of communications? And then when it comes to where it was in physical space, how do we determine where its origin came from, or did we detect it from another location? And so we would then kind of pull information from multiple resources, radars that we have on the coastlines in the United States, and then we would look for other mechanisms to see if we can utilize some other capabilities across the world, and it just kind of aggregate all of that data together and then try to formulate a picture that would be resolved by any leadership. So it's a pretty complex process.
Yeah, it
It
sounds
does
like
take
it.
some time. Um, for aircraft, of course, the Air Force would also utilize some of their resources as well, to try to get some kind of identification of what those objects might be or where they came from. In the case of the balloon, right, that we
Right,
all
thank
know and
you.
well,
Yeah.
yeah, where it came from. It came out in the media that we had seen it take off from its location from Hainan Island in China. And so we had been keeping a close eye on it for quite some time, which is pretty standard operating procedure. Ensuring the national security includes monitoring what adversary actions are taking place and ensuring that they're not going to threaten not just our own national security, but even allies. Um, Not everything is done nefariously all the time.
Mm.
Most of the time they're doing monitoring just like we are, which is pretty standard, to say the least. But
Yes, we're all
yeah,
watching.
yeah, we keep
Watching
a
you
close
watch
eye.
me.
Yeah. Which is
Yeah.
good. The military is keeping a watchful eye on any potential threats, which is great. And, we have a lot of dedicated military men and women out there that are doing this around the clock and away from families sometimes. So it's important to have us, especially when it comes to national security and protecting Americans like you from all over the world, not just in the US, but even overseas. So
Exactly, that's kind of thing.
yeah.
But it sort of goes full circle. What you said that your background was being in intelligence analysis. So
Mhm.
everything is about data analysis that you have and that you're integrating it into there. So it sounds like that background was really fortuitous or one of the right things to do.
Yeah.
Was looking at data. Well, listen, I think we're going to have a lot more of those observations. So I'll look forward to seeing
Yeah.
how is all integrated and how our separate parts of military and civilians work together in order to assess and understand what's going on. So I think that's
Sure.
exciting. So I have
Yeah.
one last question for you, and I'm going to let you go because you've been so generous with your time.
Yeah.
Space Force logo I'm seeing on your shirt. Where
Yeah.
did that
Um,
What's it
very,
looks a
very
little like
unique.
Star Trek.
Yeah. A lot of people have commented on the logo and its origins, and it looks like Star Trek. Back in actually what some people have said, like, hey, that looks a lot like the Star Trek logo, or it's very similar to it, or it
Mhm.
was stolen from them. Well, when Star Trek came out as a season, they actually took their design of their logo from the military. They created their own logo from based off of our own space programs. We've used the Delta as a symbol for decades, and it's been in a lot of our literature and a lot of our mottos, as a lot of our publications out there. The star in the middle is the Star Polaris. It's the guiding star, the North Star, if you will. And the Delta is, always pursuing a higher elevation. So you're looking at the Delta going into space. It's also the shape of kind of like hypersonic glide vehicles, usually are pointed. And, it's just a really unique symbol, honestly.
Yeah. It is. It's catching on that. That's what I wanted
Yeah.
to do. Well, good. Well, wonderful. Is there
Cool.
anything that I haven't asked that you think that people would like to know about Space Force?
I guess primarily when it comes to joining the Space Force or having more interest in the Space Force, there is a lot of open source information that anyone can get access to. And by all means, I encourage you to search. Of course, if you are interested in joining, I'm not a recruiter by any means, but talk to a local Air Force recruiter or talk to somebody who is in the Space Force like myself. You can reach out to me through social media. Pretty easy to find me.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, it's a really great career. There's a lot of different opportunities. You don't have to have an extensive background, like I said before, in what I have for my education, but space operations is a growing field, and we're finding more and more commercial companies hiring and acquiring people with backgrounds like myself to support their programs in the future. And we're going to persistently, explore space and future Mars missions, and it's a really exciting time. It's almost like a boyhood dream because I used to watch it on TV and sci-fi cartoons, and to see that we now have rockets that come back and land on Earth. It's a really exciting time to be a part of space and Space Force.
Terrific on that. Well, space, it is the final frontier, as they say.
Yes.
And so it's wonderful. Well, Chuck, Captain Chuck, I will leave this on that. This is Lisa from
Cool.
Question the Narrative. I hope you found this informative. I'm questioning this and I'm going to explore a little bit more. Chuck, thank you for your time, and I wish everybody a great day.
Absolutely. Thank you.